Chapter 25. So chapter 25 is going to talk about early Earth and how there was a point where there was no life on Earth, and all of a sudden there was. Lots of theories are out there about how that happened, and we're going to talk about the most accepted theories that are out there. So a couple of things to remember when we talk about life on Earth. First one is that there were a lot of geologic events that were happening, and that definitely caused some things to happen that may have led to life on Earth. And the other thing you want to think about, and this is very true now with humans being as awesome as they are, is that we are affecting the Earth conversely, right? So like global warming and all of that, it's pretty apparent that humans and our activities are affecting the Earth. So it can kind of go in both directions. So what we're going to do is kind of go through like major milestones of life on Earth and like what happened and how it happened, and then talk about it in a little more detail. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is when we think life originated on Earth. So it was hypothesized that happened about 3.5 to 4 billion years ago, so quite a long time ago. And if we think about planet Earth, planet Earth formed about 4.6 billion years ago. So for 0.6 billion years, there was a time when there was no life, and then around that time is when they think life came about. So the reason that we say 3.5 billion years is because the oldest fossils that have been found were found off the west coast of Australia, and they're about 3.5 billion years old. So that's going to be how that worked. Now, the type of life that started was going to be prokaryotes, which are bacteria. So obviously that makes sense. They're simpler, and we'll talk about how they led to eukaryotes. Sorry, my brain's not working. Okay, so anyway, prokaryotes were on the Earth by themselves for about 1.5 billion years. So that explains a lot about like why they might have some different types of defenses and mechanisms that our cells don't have, and it might just be that we haven't been around long enough to adapt and use those things. So when we talk about viruses, we'll get into that. So a big question I get asked is, where the hell do you find bacterial fossils? So obviously you're not going to just, go out in Colorado and start chomping away at rocks. Wow, I don't know why this keeps going on. So there are going to be two places that are going to have a lot of fossils of prokaryotes: stromatolites and hydrothermal vents. So if we look at the PowerPoint pictures, here are some pictures of those. So what stromatolites are is they're layers and layers and layers of these microbial mats. So it's kind of like these biofilms, and then a layer comes on top of them and so on, and then they basically turn into rock. And here you can see what they look like on the side. So I've seen them before. They're kind of spongy on the top, and then they kind of get hard underneath. I actually was jumping from one to the other, which I wouldn't exactly recommend. I didn't know. I was a kid. Anyway, so you can see these layers here, and that's going to be where you could find a lot of those prokaryotic fossils. Now, another place that they're finding them is hydrothermal vents. And this is a little bit more recent of a find because hydrothermal vents were only discovered not too long ago. And so what hydrothermal vents are they're basically like underwater volcanoes, and they're a very toxic place to live. So only certain things can live there. Very, very deep, lots of sulfuric acid in the water from them. So that's another location where they found a bunch of them. So back to our notes, those are going to be the two places that they've been found. Now, the next big thing that started to happen evolutionarily was going to be oxygen accumulating in the atmosphere. And that started to happen about 2.7 billion years ago. And so the reason that we know this is because they can actually look at rocks that are from that age that have iron in them, and they can actually see that the iron has oxidized. So I have a picture here of these rocks that had iron in them and have oxidized from the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere. So that's the evidence they have for it. Why we're talking about it is because of the way it happened. So what happened was you've got all these photosynthetic bacteria, and they're going to start making oxygen, and there's not a lot of other organisms there to take up the oxygen. So what happened was all of this oxygen built up and built up in the atmosphere, and it actually got to a point where it was toxic. So I don't know if you're aware, but like we only breathe a very low percent of oxygen, like 21% oxygen in the air that we breathe. If we were to breathe pure oxygen, that could actually kill us eventually. So it's kind of the whole moderation thing, right? There's certain levels of stuff that we want. And that's what happened in the atmosphere. So all this oxygen accumulated, and it ended up killing off a lot of that life that had started on Earth. And so that's going to be really important. But the other thing that's important is that that actually ended up keeping in the atmosphere, and that's how the atmosphere actually started to form. So that's an important milestone in evolutionary history as well. So the next big thing was going to be eukaryotic life coming about, and that happened about 2.1 billion years ago. So you can see prokaryotes were around for a long time before we actually showed up, about 1.5 billion years later. So the big question was, how did eukaryotes come about if all we had was prokaryotes? And so there's a theory that's called endosymbiosis, and this is a picture of what I'm talking about. So obviously the differences between prokaryotes and eukaryotes is that eukaryotes have organelles. And there's kind of two types of organelles. You have plasmids, and then you have the endomembrane system. And so endomembrane, if you think about like the ER, the Golgi apparatus, the nuclear membrane, all that type of stuff, that's basically made of membranous material. So the idea is that the membrane of that prokaryote just like folded in on itself, and that's how you ended up with those membranous organelles. Then the other ideas were about how did mitochondria and chloroplasts get there. And the idea was that those used to be their own organism, their own little bacteria that was just kind of sitting there, and then they got engulfed by another bacteria and became an organelle in that larger bacteria. And so you can see that right here. So that's how they think mitochondria and chloroplasts came to be. And the reason that they're really supportive of that idea is because mitochondria and plasmids both have their own DNA. So that kind of supports that idea. So that's the theory of endosymbiosis. Okay, next big milestone in history is going to be multicellular eukaryotes evolving. So that's going to be, we had these little unicellular eukaryotes, and now we're going to have multicellular ones that are organisms. And so the first type of multicellular eukaryotes that came about were protists. And protists are going to be things like amoeba and kelp, and you're going to learn all about those in lab, don't worry. And so those are the first eukaryotes that came about. Now, it's kind of interesting because if you look at, like, if we were going to make like a graph of diversity and how diversity was kind of exploding like this, it kind of leveled off from this period, 750 to 570 million years ago. And the reason for that is because there was a pretty severe ice age at that time. So I know Disney wants you to think that there was like one big ice age and it like was woolly, or I don't even know the names of the characters, but you know what I'm talking about. That's not exactly how it works. There were a lot of ice ages, and this one was a very serious one, very severe one, and that's called Snowball Earth at that point. And what they found is that the diversity leveled off and even went down a little bit because of that. And the only places they really found rich amounts of fossils from that time are near places where it would be warm. So hydrothermal vents, near areas where the sun could penetrate through the ice, and near hot springs, right? Those would be places where it would be a little bit safer during an ice age. Okay. So that's the next big milestone. Then we've got animals coming onto the scene. So the first animals that came about were going to be cnidarians, so the C is silent on that one, which are jellyfish and corals and anemones and things like that. And then poriferans, which are going to be sponges. So in case if you're not familiar with the way that those look, I can scroll through here. There's your Snowball Earth. And there are our first animals. So here you can see cnidarians here, and this is actually a mixture of cnidarians and poriferans. And you know what's crazy? In a couple of months, you're going to look at this picture and you'll be able to name the phylum and class for everything you see in this picture. Just amazing. Okay, so back to our notes. So we have our animals coming about. Now this is all in the ocean. The next big thing was getting onto land. So getting onto land was going to be a big deal. And if you think about things that are living on the land or in the water and they're coming onto land, there's a couple of things that they need to be able to do and have adaptations to do. One is they've got to avoid being dried out, and the other one is they've got to be able to reproduce on land. If you think about the way things in the water tend to reproduce in general, they just throw their gametes out there and hope that a male one meets a female one. Very, very easy. If you try that on land, they're going to dry out, they're going to get damaged, it's not going to work. So having adaptations like internal fertilization, stuff like that, seeds and things, that's going to help. We're going to talk about those when we get into plants and animals and how that actually works. So that was going to be a big, big milestone is coming onto land. So in the next video, we'll actually talk about the process of how those first bacteria came to be and the fact that they've proven 3 out of the 4 stages in that.